Just recently, the Sega Saturn had its 30th birthday, celebrating its original 1994 Japanese launch. Amid that happy time, another birthday came and went with little fanfare. The Saturn's little brother, the Sega 32X, had also been released in November of 1994, but not many people were excited to talk about it. It goes without saying that the 32X was not seen as a particularly exciting product, given that it arrived so close in proximity to the Saturn. Any noise that it could have made was further deafened by the early launch of the Saturn in North America. From there, most of you know the story of disappointing software releases, mountains of canceled projects, poor sales, and ultimately, the platform's demise and resulting hatred by the gaming community at large. But for all its failures, the Sega 32X had been an interesting idea, and more than one old school Sega fan had enjoyed some of its games. That got me to thinking about an episode covering the device at its 30th anniversary. We are going to go over the entire library of the 32X and see which games are worth playing and which games are not worth the effort. I've devised a simple 5-star rating system where 1 star represents a don't bother with it, and 5 stars is of course a must play. I've got 40 titles for you, so let's get started. Afterburner Complete was a port of the arcade Afterburner 2. It's not quite as smooth as the arcade, but it's fast, looks incredible, and sounds great. It captures enough of the original feel to be one of the better conversions of this game. This one is a keeper, 4 stars. BC Racers is a spin-off of the Chuck Rock series. This time we get a kart racer that looks a bit like the 16-bit Super Mario Kart. This one has always been a bit janky, though it's fun in short play sessions. The stage variety is solid and the different racers gives you some gameplay to explore. Not bad, not great, let's leave this one at 3 stars. Cinematic platformers aren't everyone's cup of tea, but I really do highly recommend you try Blackthorn. This one has a great story about a badass returning home to reclaim his kingdom and get revenge for his people. The hide and fight gameplay is fun and very easy to learn. The stages have a puzzle and exploration element that keeps things interesting, and it's very challenging in the late game. Add in some nice visuals and animation, and you have a great game for a couple of days. 4 stars. Brutal Unleashed Above the Claw is a one-on-one fighting game with animals. It's a 32-bit update to the previously released Brutal Paws of Fury, and it's about as shallow as fighting games get. The colorful visuals are a pretty veneer for its unbalanced roster, horrific AI, and ridiculous progression system. You actually have to learn the special moves as you move through the fights, meaning the early game gives you shockingly little to use. There's worse fighting games out there to be sure, but this turd isn't worth the ROM it's burned to. 2 stars, and that's generous. Knuckles Chaotix was supposed to be the 32X's Sonic equivalent. It succeeded to a certain degree, and I enjoy this game for the things it does well. The visuals are super colorful and the soundtrack is top tier, but the rubber band gameplay will absolutely try your patience. You do get a flow with it eventually, but it never feels 100% proper, and leaves you always wondering how much better this could have been without it. Not bad by any means, but also not the game it could have been. 3 stars. Corpse Killer is our first 32X CD title on the list. It's got a number of familiar faces in its cast, and it's easy to enjoy the B-movie zombie setting. In the end, you are left with a full motion video gun game that is neither deep nor particularly fun to play, leaving it as kind of a one and done when you play it. Those that appreciate the camp will get more out of it, but for the rest, this is 2-star entertainment. Cosmic Carnage in a lot of ways is a study of everything that was wrong with the 32X. Sega basically had a small studio throw this fighting game together in a short amount of time to release on the 32X right after it launched. Everything is so uninspired and cobbled together, right down to an armor system that never really matters. To add to the pain, Sega actually had the audacity to ask 32X owners to pay $70 for this. Software like this was never gonna sell this device to the masses. Modern gamers will turn their noses up to it as well. 2 stars. Darkseid was one of the few PAL exclusives on the 32X. It's a space shooter that is effectively a 3D version of Asteroids. It features textured mapping, something you didn't get a lot of on the device. If you like blowing stuff up, this can hold your attention for a bit, but in the end, there is nothing much here to recommend. 2 stars. The 32X Doom was the way I first played this game. I didn't have a computer growing up, so I was very happy to have it. I had no idea what I was missing, so I got my money's worth and then some from it. The bias I have for it is absolute, and the resulting score will be skewed heavily. Fan projects have driven it to 5-star levels of goodness, but even so, it's a 4-star game for me on nostalgia alone. Fahrenheit was another 32X CD title, perhaps the most interesting of the bunch. The gameplay is little more than choosing a route through buildings that are on fire. It does have a certain amount of exploration to it, but it's your typical nothing new to see after you play it once. What is interesting about this one was the inclusion of the 32X version for free if you bought the Sega CD edition. Decent from a historical perspective, but still a 2-star experience. FIFA 96 was a 4-player soccer title that wasn't too bad on the old 32X. You get a textured mapped field with 2D player sprites that worked pretty well. Kinda makes you wonder what a Madden would have looked like on the device. It was another one that was only released in PAL regions. 3 stars. I want to tell you that Golf Magazine 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples is an incredible game of golf. I want to tell you its visuals and sound are impeccable. Its multiplayer unmissable, yet I would be lying if I did. This is an average game of golf that does nothing particularly well, nor does it suck to high heaven. It is what it is, an average game. 3 stars. Colibri is one of the few 2D shoot-em-ups on the 32X. It's also incredibly difficult to score. The visuals themselves are often beautiful, and the gameplay very challenging. Much of what you face here is done while you have complete control over the stage, meaning you can go anywhere you want. It also has co-op multiplayer. What it needed was a more effective weapon system and more balance to its stage layouts. It's fun, but compared to the better examples of the genre, it's woefully outmatched. 3 stars. Metalhead is a mech shooter that had some potential, yet is hamstrung by gameplay that is just boring as can be. I wanted to like the premise. I mean, who doesn't love the idea of running around in a giant robot blowing things up? But after 20 minutes or so of the slow and plodding gameplay, it just never picks up or gets exciting. The presentation is also severely hampered by the cartridge format that gives us poor sound and voice work and an overly simplified interface. It's another one that Sega spat out for far too much money that delivered nothing worth your time. It's 2 stars at best. The 32X received a port of Mortal Kombat 2, the popular arcade fighting game by Midway. It was essentially an enhancement of the prior Genesis release with more color, better sound effects, and a few additional visual upgrades here and there. While still a far cry from being arcade perfect, I did enjoy this quite a bit. It was my favorite home conversion for years, and I still consider it one of the better games on the device. It could have been so much more, and for that it loses a star. I give it 4 stars as a result.
Outstanding. Finisher. Scorpion wins. Fatality.
Like the fighting game Cosmic Carnage, Motocross Championship was a complete embarrassment. Thrown together and lacking anything of merit, This racing game is among some of the worst for the device. I'd rather have my testicles stepped on than endure this pile of garbage for more than a few minutes. Crap graphics, terrible sound, horrific gameplay, and a price tag of $60 made me almost abandon Sega of America's products. It is one-star drivel that I wish I could give a 0. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was such a nice conversion to the 32X. It had more color than the Genesis edition and included the scaling players. The multiplayer is spot on and the roster has been updated. That's on top of the many other enhancements this version already had. It's virtually timeless in its playability, 4 stars. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same good things about the 32X version of NFL Quarterback Club. This series was never particularly good and not much has changed on the 32X. The color is improved, the new field perspective lets you see more, and it does appear to have more animations, but in the end it was still a poor man's Madden. In its defense, it is playable, so it earns 3 stars for not being a complete waste of time. Night Trap was one of the most famous full-motion video games you will ever hear about. It was paraded around the video game violence hearings in the early 1990s as some sort of poster child for everything corrupting your children. Yet the fools doing it didn't even know what the game was about. But for all the bluster it received back then, I genuinely considered this one of the better games of its type. The story is mildly entertaining and the trial and error gameplay of capturing bad guys and saving scantily clad young women is good for a few play sessions. It looked a lot better on the 32X CD thanks to a big uptick in color. 3 stars and probably about as good as full motion video games can get. Pifall the Mayan Adventure was also available on the Genesis and Sega CD, where it was arguably a better game. The 32X version has 30 frames per second foregrounds and 60 frames per second backgrounds, making the game appear a bit jerky. The Sega CD edition was cheaper, had more stages, better music, and the entire thing ran at 60 frames per second. Play it there because on the 32X, this half-assed port is at best 2 stars. Primal Rage on the 32X improves on the base Genesis version in numerous ways. The color is much improved and the sound is better, making for a closer arcade experience. But I won't kid you, I always thought this game was janky as hell, and frankly, nowhere near as fun as the other fighters of the era. Faced with a choice of this and Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X, I'll take the latter 100% of the time. 3 stars for fans, 2 stars for the rest of you. RBI Baseball 95 is an okay game on the 32X, but it is decidedly unimpressive compared to other games that generation. A fully 2D experience by this point was a massive cop-out for its $60 price point. The color is muddy, the sound isn't the best, and the content no more impressive than the base machine had been producing for years. You can do a lot worse, but it's still 2 stars at best. Sango Kushi 4 was a Japanese exclusive, the 4th entry into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series. Since the language barrier here is a massive hurdle, I will refrain from rating it based on my inability to really play it. The same game was also ported to the Sega Saturn and does have a Western variant. Try it there if you're interested. A basketball full-motion video game is indeed as bad as it sounds. Play one-on-one against players who constantly trash talk, try to score strange, and constantly crack jokes. That's what you do in Slam City with Scottie Pippen. It's a 32X CD game that didn't need to be made. 1 star, and that's too much. The 32X version of Space Harrier was a very decent conversion. It has some slowdown and isn't as smooth as the arcade, but compared to most home versions back then, it was an absolute beast, especially once you turn up the sound. Along with Afterburner 2, it gave me hope that Sega was going to turn the 32X into a sprite scaling haven. That didn't happen, but it still didn't stop this game from being a winner. 4 stars. Spider-Man Web of Fire could easily be renamed to Spider-Man Web of Shit. because that's exactly how you feel playing this trash. Unsatisfying visuals, basic gameplay, and weak sound all drag this one to the bottom of the 32X heap. This is weaker than most standard Genesis action titles and well below its best efforts. Imagine trying to sell a 32-bit upgrade and thinking this is the software that's gonna do it. Say what you will about Sega's infighting, but Sega of America had no eye for quality software. 1 star. Star Trek Starfleet Academy Starship Bridge Simulator lets you command starships in various situations. Basically, you are a cadet in training, and these are the simulations you need to become the leader you want to be. For Trek fans, this can be rather interesting, particularly scenarios like the Kobayashi Maru. It's a big upgrade over the Super Nintendo original, but it's still not an impressive journey. The visuals are tame, the polygons simple, and the boredom can be oppressive at times. Fans of the IP will explore it deeper, but it's 2 stars otherwise. Star Wars Arcade originally appeared on the Sega Model 1 in the arcade. The 32X port was cut back heavily with lower polygon models and performance. I could have lived with that, but what I have trouble with is a game so difficult it impacts the fun, and Star Wars Arcade is one tough cookie. It punishes newcomers viciously, and you'll need a lot of patience to get anywhere. On the plus side, it's Star Wars, and running these missions with this ship, listening to this music, is still very fun. I am somewhat angry with this port because I feel it would have been so much better on the Sega Saturn, but as it is, it's still a 3-star release and worth playing. You can tell the developers had a great idea with Stellar Assault. This is a space combat shooter that is one of the more impressive games on the device in terms of technology. The 2 available ships enable you some wildly different gameplay, alternating between full control, go anywhere play, versus on-rail shooting action akin to games like Starblade. You can tell it has the bones of a much bigger and better game, which ultimately materialized on the Sega Saturn. Still, it's got some fun in one of the better 32-bit releases on the platform. If you have a friend to play with, you can roll in 2-player mode as pilot and gunner. Good stuff that needed a bit more time to be great. A solid 3 stars. I got another 32X CD game for you, the full motion video fighting game Supreme Warrior. The story and setting is the draw here and can be entertaining in that regard, but the gameplay is going to be pretty low on appeal for many of you. The idea is to block and strike at the appropriate times, but it never feels smooth or natural. The disjointed sprite work against the full motion video is jarring and really grates on your nerves. After a bit, your tolerance will fail, especially after having to restart and play the same sequences again and again. 2 stars at best. Our last 32X CD game was a full motion video shooter that was released in Brazil only, Surgical Strike. This was a Sega CD game in the rest of the world, and Tectoy decided to bring the cancelled 32X release out on their own. It's similar to Sewer Shark in that you are both gunner and pilot, blowing up enemies and then choosing directions for your hovercraft to take. You can only beat this game on hard because the normal difficulty lacks the final mission. It's interesting because the original Tectoy release is so rare, but as far as game quality, it's low tier, forgettable, full motion video fare. 2 stars. T-Mech is a port of an Atari arcade game that had you battling in arenas using hover tanks. It sounds cool, but the end result is a really unimpressive title. Nothing here screams that it couldn't have been done on the Sega CD, and it's yet another half-baked release that was simply not gonna sell the hardware. Sega went crazy trying to pick up anything and publish it for the 32X, just to get games out for it. This was the fundamental flaw in the 32X plan. Sega thought as long as it was on store shelves, gamers would buy it. Someone forgot to explain to Sega management that games actually needed to be good to sell. 1 star. Tempo was a 2D platformer that was decent on the 32X. It's hyper colorful and has a super cute main character. The gameplay is just okay, however. You'll have fun with it as there is nothing broken, but the stage design, enemies, and overall presentation won't hold your attention for long. Jump into it and get the most out of it while you can. 3 stars. Tough Man Contest takes a number of cues from the likes of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but never reaches the same level of excellence. It's a third-person boxing game where you battle other fighters from around the world. The presentation sees an upgrade across the board from the Genesis release, but it's still not a great-looking and sounding game. The gameplay can be fun with lots of technique and punches to learn. This one is 3 stars in this library, though the Genesis itself has way better boxing games. When the Virtua Fighter port came to the 32X, the platform was already in steep decline and well on its way to the glue factory. When I played it, I was half expecting Sega to have phoned this one in, but you know what? This is a very good port. The polygon models are much lower than both the arcade and Saturn editions, but they still get the job done. The sound and music likewise are cut back heavily, but again, do enough to feel proper. The real win here is the gameplay, which feels good and is by far the best fighter on this platform. In fact, this will be one of only 2 5-star games you will find on the 32X. It felt like a true 32-bit release, and something you never would have seen on the Genesis or Sega CD at the same level. If only Sega understood just how important that was. Like Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing Deluxe felt like something that could help sell a platform. This is an enhanced arcade port with additional cars and tracks. It is a major improvement over the SVP-powered Genesis edition in every single way. The color sees a major bump, the models are more sophisticated, the tracks look worlds better, and the sound is spruced up. It's still hard as hell, but the action is so much better than any other racer on the 32X, you just won't care. If you enjoyed the arcade or Genesis versions, this one should be a perfect addition to your 32X library. 5 stars all the way. The World Series baseball titles were genuinely decent games on the Genesis, but on the 32X, it's another shallow 16-bit port with little to offer. You get a boost in color, a nifty zooming feature in the outfield, improved sound, and little else. It's a better game than RBI Baseball, but still well below what should have been released for a fledgling 32-bit platform competing with the likes of the Saturn and PlayStation. It's 3 stars at best. I am a fan of WWF Raw. The 16-bit version soaked up many an hour for me and my friends. The 32X port sees more color and some improved sound effects, but this isn't a 32-bit game as far as expectations. It's a mildly improved 16-bit port that was a fun game to begin with. That makes it rather difficult to rate, honestly. Part of me really wants to talk up its 4-player mayhem, while I also want to crush it for not being more than it actually is. I'll meet the two in the middle and give it 3 stars. It's great fun with friends, but far from a must-play the 32X really needed. Yep, there were 2 wrestling games for the 32X. WWF WrestleMania the arcade game was a port of the arcade classic Midway Brawler. This uses digitized graphics and lots of speech to give you a fast and brutally efficient game of sports entertainment. The visuals and overall presentation are much more in line with your 32-bit expectations versus the last WWF title. This feels like a game worth your upgrade. The only thing that outright stinks is the lack of the 4-player action found in WWF Raw, and it lacks the 6-player Royal Rumble. Loads of fun to be had though, 3 stars. Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000 is an interesting game to say the least. It takes the idea and viewpoint behind the original Zaxxon and adds polygon enemies and structures. You can also switch up vehicles here to radically change your gameplay options. It's held back a bit by some design elements that never really let it spread its wings. It's slow, clunky, and the visuals never really get beyond that unfinished feeling. If it had more time in development, it may have been something more, but at this state, it's 2 stars at best. I really do wish I could tell you the legacy of the 32X was more positive, but it really isn't. It's true that like all consoles, it has a number of games worth investigating. It's also true that you can easily find Sega fans that enjoyed their time with it when they were younger. But this device also had a disappointingly short life, with dozens of cancelled games that never saw the light of day. Sega promised the world yet delivered so very little before the device was terminated unceremoniously, barely over a year after its release. It was another link in a long chain of bad decisions that nearly led the company to ruin. You don't really celebrate a machine like the 32X, but instead lament the lost potential because of it. 30 years later, I think we can all agree that Sega would have been much better off without it. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.